I'm Beth Carroll speaking to Dr. Bobby Fokides, who is an associate professor at Rollins and chair of the Department of Biology there at Rollins College. And we're going to talk about something really interesting, which is coyotes in Winter Park. This is really interesting. Thank you for joining me. Would you go ahead first and tell me sort of your expertise in this area as a biologist? Do you work with this type of animal?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. I am a wildlife biologist and I study a number of different types of animals, but most importantly, I'm interested in urbanization and its impacts on wildlife. Coyotes kind of fall into that. They're a very adaptable species, and they're an animal that we're seeing increasingly more and more in cities, including in Central Florida, in places like Winter Park, for example. My research has been exploring sort of how they use this environment, how they move around, what sort of corridors and pathways, how they're getting into the city, do they stay in the city, and not just coyotes, in general, all kinds of animals.
I remember about 20, 25 years ago, I remember looking out of my office window and there was a fox there. And nowadays I see cats, but that's about it as animals. So certainly as things have become more urban, I'm seeing less animals, but am I mistaken? Are they out there and I'm not seeing them?
Well, you're drawing on a really important question. In the past, we viewed cities as being these places that are intruding on ecosystems and places where they have a negative effect on animals around them. And for many species, that is the case. But increasingly, in animal conservation circles, we're starting to view the city as an ecosystem in and of itself. And part of that involves, animals replacing one another. There's only so much room for predators. You say you looked outside your window and you used to see foxes and now you see cats. Well, they're going to be competitors. They're going to be going for the same things. Coyotes are also part of this because now coyotes move in. And one thing about dogs in general, wild dogs, is they tend to exclude each other. So if you start getting coyotes moving into an area, then the foxes which are smaller, are going to start moving away. So those are the kind of things that we're starting to look at. And as cities, continue to grow and expand and encroach, we want to know how we can better design cities and manage cities so that we can sort of minimize their effect on some of the really cool native wildlife that's out there.
Well, I certainly want to dig into that, but let's set the stage. Tell me about this coyote sighting.
Okay, it was quite surprising. I'll throw that out there. So, like I said, we've been trying to understand, animals and how they move through a city, how they use different areas of a city, and how do they persist in an area? Do they stay in one area and then move? And questions like that. So, in order to answer this question, we've been setting out these camera traps, which are these passive traps that you just set out, and they have a motion detector. An animal walks past them, it's going to trigger it and take a photo or a video. And they're really great because they allow you to essentially be an observer when there is no observer. And depending how long the battery life lives, they can record over a long period of time. And so we've been setting these out in various areas around the city, and including the Genius Preserve, which is where this sighting came from. And we've been trying to particularly pick up a lot of animals, not just coyotes, but in fact foxes, skunks. Foxes and skunks is actually a big part of it. Also things like muskrats, some of the lesser known animals. We get a lot of opossums, we get a lot of raccoons, kind of the typical city animals. So we've been trying to target them. And in the midst of doing this, we get coyotes pretty regularly. Now, this particular trap was set on the Genius Preserve, which is a privately owned site that's close to Rollins College. And because it's close to Rollins College and with the limitations that COVID has placed on us as far as our classes, I've used it as a site for one of my field courses that I teach, field zoology. So me and the students went out there and we thought at first that we had seen a fox on the recording, but when we checked the actual traps, we saw that it was this black coyote, and then we realized it was something kind of special. So this one trap recorded it 3 times, and it was also picked up by another couple of traps. So we have quite a bit of footage of this thing, which tells us that it's probably hanging around that area. So it's just kind of one of those sort of happy accidents that we found this thing.
So do coyotes travel in packs? Can we assume that there are more based on the one?
There are certainly more coyotes on the property, and we actually have video of it interacting with another coyote, which is of the typical sort of beige brown coloration. So it's a very good chance that's the mate. or the partner. So, moving into the winter now, one of the things we want to do is see if we could figure out if it's breeding on the property and maybe set up on its den. We could start asking some questions about like, well, you've got this melanistic trait, this black coyote. Does it produce black furred offspring? Questions like that. So we're sort of in the midst of trying to figure out the next step, but definitely it's going to involve more trail cameras.
I have to ask you a really basic question here. How do you know the difference between a coyote and another canine or a dog? That, you know what I mean? Is it bigger? Is it smaller? What does it look like?
That's actually a good question. So typically the coyotes they're sort of a medium-sized dog, if you will. They're a little bit bigger than a fox, a little stockier. They got longer legs. A fox is usually pretty distinctive. It's got a lot of fur and a really big bushy tail. Dogs, on the other hand, they tend to be, depending on, obviously they come in a variety of different shapes, but they tend to be a little bit stockier. And then there's also cranial features. A coyote has a very sloped head, whereas the forehead of a dog is a little more pronounced, regardless of the breed. And there's things like that. But that is one of the questions. And fun fact about canines, and one of the reasons why we have domestic dogs in the first place is because they're so genetically flexible. And one issue that does create is hybridization. So there's also the possibility that this could be either a recent or a very, far back hybrid between a coyote and a dog, for that matter. So we don't know 100%, but based on its behavior, based on its interactions with this other animal, it's very likely it's a coyote.
Will you try to gather fecal matter or anything to check the DNA?
Well, that's a good question. We've actually set the camera traps up with things like barbed wire and little rubbing posts, potentially to get hair that we can use for DNA analysis. Fecal matter is a little trickier because obviously there's going to be other things in there as well. But hair traps have been pretty well shown. The tricky thing with hair traps with dogs is getting them to do something that will leave hair in the first place. So they'll come, we have scent baits, we'll set them out, they'll go over there and they'll sniff them, but they might not necessarily do something that would leave hair, like rub against the post or something like that. It's actually pretty tricky. It's hard to target a specific coyote.
Right, right. Will your students be a part of that, or how involved are your students in this study?
Well, at Rollins College, we're primarily an undergraduate institution, and we like to do research that incorporates undergraduates at all levels. So this discovery was made during the course of a class. I do have a lab, and I have students in the lab. I'm planning on setting up a project with, one or two student volunteers to basically maintain these traps, check these traps, and basically collect data as part of the bigger project, but also with this whole black coyote being there as well.
They must be pretty excited about it, though.
They are pretty excited about it, actually. It's this, we're trying to start the myth of the Winter Park black coyote. Let's try and create an urban legend if we can. So it's been out there on social media and stuff like that. So they like that, and I think it's cool because it teaches them that you can learn about wildlife and you could learn about animals and do biology even in an urban setting like this. Like, everybody wants to be the biologist on top of a Jeep in Africa, but you can do it here as well.
Well, let's talk more about that then, the urbanization of the area. And you said earlier that usually means that certain animals move in as others move out. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about that and the current situation in Winter Park. What did we learn from the coyote being there?
Okay, well, so as a place becomes urban, and we say urban as a city, but of course within a city you can have a lot of different types of places, right? You can have a very parkland-like atmosphere, kind of like you have at Winter Park, or you can have a more, urban concrete jungle type thing you might have, say, downtown. So it really depends on that sort of scale. As far as urbanization goes, a big thing is what are the animals that are there and how many of them stayed there and how many of them migrated there from somewhere else. And I think that tells us a little bit about how they're going to use certain areas. So for example, the Genius Preserve, it's this protected area, it's gated off, it doesn't have a lot of traffic, not a lot of people on site. And it's a good sized area. It's about 48 acres. And it's a parkland, but there's some remnant forests in there as well. So it serves as a nice refuge. So in a place like Winter Park, where you have a lot of development around there, it does serve as kind of like a refuge that an animal like a coyote could potentially, live there and just foray into the city. And then the question is, how did it get there, right? So, one thing Winter Park also has is, train tracks. And I know studies in other cities like Chicago and Atlanta showed that coyotes really use things like that as corridors. So they basically make their way through the city using trains, which makes perfect sense because not a lot of people, they can hide pretty well. And, they're usually forested and kind of running through locations kind of as straight as possible. So they serve as nice little corridors. So the proximity there could be, one way that coyotes can keep popping up in Winter Park. And we've been seeing more and more coyotes in Winter Park. So as far as what they're doing once they're here, well, they would represent a sort of a top predator. So it's already there. I've heard stories. I haven't seen any. It's one of the things we're looking for. But there used to be a red foxes that lived on the Genius Preserve, and then the coyote showed up. Same sort of thing, right? And this is the sort of thing that plays out in a lot of places.
Okay, I have to interrupt you for there. So you're not suggesting they ate the foxes, they just eat the same thing and the foxes aren't big enough to get theirs. Is that the situation?
Actually, we can't rule out either of those, to be honest.
Oh,
I know it's hard to think about. I know, but the
nature is
reality
ugly.
is there is a big size difference, and nature's nature's got its own rules. Very very possible that they showed up and it just basically made the foxes nervous and just they decided to abandon the area, which often is the case. Just when an animal shows up, smaller animals that could potentially be prey will often vacate the area if it hangs around too long. And we already know that coyotes pose a threat to pets. They pose a threat to small dogs and cats. A fox is not that much bigger than a small dog. So, but coyotes are still kind of neat.
The other thing I want to pick up on is that following the tracks, you said.
Mhm.
And so we often think of the urban part of things, the concrete, if you will, as being a barrier, and the animals will kind of see that or be scared of that and not go into it. Clearly, that's not the case. So, are they going to stay on the preserve or do we see them moving around the city?
They move around the city, and actually, one of the sort of preeminent characteristics of a good, successful urban animal is being bold. And you can actually study this in the field. You can have them, test to see how much time they'd spent around a novel object. Put something in their environment or in their territory that they've never encountered before, and see if they're naturally curious or if they flee, and things like that. And what one thing about the coyotes, and it's actually a real edge on some of the other animals like wolves, for example, or even foxes, is that they have a natural curiosity and they're very bold. And I've in the middle of the day in a parking lot, I've literally had a coyote just walk like 2 feet away from me, just walk right past me, not even bothering to look at me. So they've obviously, some of them have accustomed themselves to humans. So that's going to come from being bold and approachable. And when you combine that with getting new food sources, that's a good making of an urban animal. So it's a very good chance that they'll probably stick around. Maybe for generations. Maybe we're seeing the beginning of a coyote dynasty on the Genius Preserve.
You are not big enough for food. Is that what the end of the story is there? I mean, should you
Well,
have been afraid?
well, coyotes aren't naturally aggressive, but they do sometimes come off as really, really bold. And you should always take precautions. I mean, it is, it's a good sized animal. They don't tend to they don't tend to do unprovoked attacks on adults. Often there's either some sort of provocation, whether intended or otherwise, or there could be something wrong with a coyote. I'm thinking rabies or something like that. But they do pose a threat to pets, and they certainly can pose a threat to children, small children. So definitely keep your distance from coyotes and any wild animal. Right? But in Florida, we're a big part of our natural character is the proximity that we have to very large and dangerous animals. So whether it's alligators or or bears or panthers or sharks or snakes. We've learned to coexist with these animals. We have to learn to coexist with coyotes because they're not going to go anywhere.
Tell me a little bit more about the coexisting, and I'm sure you get asked questions maybe by city officials on what's the best way to handle things. You mentioned the bear. I remember not long ago, a bear wandering into downtown. And so what is your advice to how we coexist in a way that is meaningful for both the human and the animal?
That's a good question, and it's a steadily evolving question. The main thing is sort of a respectful distance and maintaining that. So that not only means keeping your distance when you actually see a coyote, but also not doing anything to actively encourage and alter coyote behavior. So sort of it stands true, and it's been around for a while. But the cliche of feeding animals, right? That's not a very good thing to do, because you are artificially altering their behavior and encouraging interactions with people, right? So the best is if we can sort of coexist by having essentially neutral interactions where we don't have to do anything negative to scare them off, but we also don't do anything positive to bring them in. So that way we can kind of encounter them on their own terms when they happen to be around. But respectful distance, certainly feeding animals is actively discouraged, and that includes also keeping some of our beloved pets indoors, especially at nighttime when they are most active. So dogs and cats. Cats should be inside anyway because they can cause a lot of havoc with bird populations. But yeah, I mean those are sort of things we can do. And over time, I think a lot of neighborhoods will often have their sort of their celebrity coyote that hangs around, and everybody knows about it and everybody respects it, and there's no negative interaction there. So I think that's really what it is.
Tell me more about what you plan to study now. And I'm sure it's not just the coyotes, but as you're looking at the animals on the preserve, what are your research questions? Or the other end of things, what trends have you noticed? What's coming out of this study?
Okay, so this study is fairly new. So we're still working on collecting and analyzing data, and especially with coronavirus, it's kind of thrown a little bit of a wrench in there. But one of the things we did notice is kind of what's been reported around with fewer people being outside, especially initially with the lockdown. We definitely noticed more activity on our cameras. Some of the things we've noticed is particular species being able to leave quite far into an urban area from, say, a source population. And what I mean by that is, a lot of the parks that we have, some of the larger areas that we have to the north of us, for example, like the Black Bear Wilderness area, Spring Hammock, Lake Jessup area, animals that are there seem to be able to just having a protected area on the outskirts is enough to cause some animals that wouldn't otherwise be considered urban animals to show up further and further in town, as compared to other places where they're a little further away from the periphery. So foxes is an example of that, and then spotted skunks would be the other example of that, things that we've noticed. And also bobcats. That's the other one that we've noticed. So it's kind of lends credence to this idea of preserving these large areas and keeping those areas just on the edge of the city wild and not developing them. We've also noticed, a lot of these mammals will quickly leave an area if it becomes completely isolated, regardless of how big it is. So for example, in Seminole County, we've been, doing some stuff at the Econ River Wilderness area. And there, there's development kind of happening kind of all around it. And as that's happening, a lot of the animals are starting to disappear. We're getting less and less detections of certain animals, even things like possums and armadillos that are normally pretty common. We're just seeing fewer and fewer of them as this development is happening. So even though that area is protected, the periphery is being developed, and that's enough to scare animals or at least move them away from where our traps are placed. So we're seeing these kind of smaller scale things. But again, we sort of just started the project in kind of a bigger scale.
So as far as city officials, public planners, and even just individual residents, what do you think the takeaways are for us in terms of how we're building our city or how we're relating to animals? Or is it too early to even go there?
we know some things from just a collective body of work that's out there, not necessarily our project per se, since we've just started. But the big emphasis there is, if I had to take away one thing, it'd be the importance of maintaining parkland within the city environment, and if possible, connecting them and producing these corridors. I think they're very important for allowing the movement of animals through a city. So, for example, the coyotes are moving through the train tracks, right? Not necessarily because the train tracks themselves are good at habitat, but because they provide a corridor that's undisturbed, right? And it's a lot easier to negotiate that than it would be to negotiate, say, a highway or to negotiate, a more developed neighborhood. And then the other thing is, as we develop, we should start thinking about, you know, um, designing our homes in a way that's going to maintain a lot of that natural, sort of habitat that we normally find. And that doesn't mean kind of just let your yard grow foul and just let it, go grow weeds and everything like that. But, encouraging some native vegetation would actually be really good, especially mature trees in Florida and things like that. It really depends on the kind of city you're dealing with too. I think about, there was an old quote, I don't remember who it was, I think it was a reporter, maybe from Oklahoma, who said that suburbia is where you chop down all the trees and then you name the streets after them. Yeah.
That's a good one. Yeah. So there in Winter Park, what do you see as being, I guess, great, if you will, the city and how it's handling the park areas and the vegetation and such?
Well, I think Winter Park is doing a pretty good job. It's it's an older developed area, so it's been around for a while. A lot of mature trees, a lot of nice forest. Definitely, a good number of parks nearby. Genius Preserve is kind of one area. Mead Gardens would be another. The Mead Gardens Botanical Area, Lou Gardens, and then a few of the other parks. It's also an area that does have, a bit of traffic, but it isn't. It doesn't have the characteristic really large roads in most areas. There are a few. So those are the things that kind of serve as barriers as well. So I think overall Winter Park is doing okay. The other benefit it has is those lakes. It's if you have lakefront property, you're going to develop it in a more naturalistic way, I think, in general. Just because you want to maintain those trees and you want to maintain that look and things like that. So I think that goes a long way.
And back to the Genius Preserve. So again, what are some of the animals that you see out there in addition to the coyote?
So the regular animals we see out there: coyote, armadillo, opossum, raccoon. We have river otters that use the lakes. It's bordered on three ends by lakes. So there's Lake Mizell, Lake Virginia, and Lake Berry, all of which have their sort of resident river otter families. And those are probably the majority. We get the occasional, feral cat on a record. The other interesting thing that's on the Genius Preserve that isn't anywhere else are our peacocks. So peacocks were actually brought in and released there, and there's I think about 15 or 20 of them in and around the Genius Preserve area, and they're kind of fun to have around. So they trip our cameras all the time. So they'll just literally walk back and forth across our cameras. So we'll set out a camera, and then in 2 days we'll have like 200 hits. And it's like, oh yeah, peacock just walked back and forth. But they're still a lot of fun to have around.
The peacocks just want to be on camera is obviously what's going on.
I think, well, you look that good with those feathers, why not?
Right. Do the numbers go up and down? Do you track the numbers?
We do. Summertime we see a lot of activity at night. As it's starting to get cooler, we've noticed we're getting a lot more sort of daytime footage. The cameras have an infrared camera that can pick up sort of nighttime detections when they walk through. It comes up as a gray image. And then you have, during the daytime, now that it's getting a little bit cooler, we're picking up a few more, animals moving around during the early morning and in the early evening and afternoon. So we're seeing some shifts in time with them being detected. But for the most part, the animals seem to be recorded kind of over and over in the same spot, which tells us that they're probably residents and they're not necessarily passing through. So we haven't had a situation where like an animal showed up, popped a couple of cameras, and then moved off, and we never saw it again. We always tend to see the same animal, even if it takes a good week or two. We see it back on another camera.
We have just a couple of minutes left. I want to give you an opportunity for just any final thoughts or anything you want to point out that maybe we didn't bring up.
Well, as far as final thoughts, I think the one thing that I like about this whole Black Coyote story is not necessarily that, that there's a Black Coyote out there, but the fact that it's a bit of a testament to, you know, there's really cool things to see if you pay attention, you know, and especially when it comes to animals like this that are moving around at night. We don't often see them. We often don't even know that they're there. There can actually be quite a lot of wildlife in and around you that you don't even know about. So, I kind of get some satisfaction in knowing that, when humans go to bed, all this other life crawls out there at nighttime and starts to take over the urban landscape, and that kind of makes me feel a little optimistic about the future and with cities and everything.
Well, thank you for speaking to us about this. It's been a pleasure. I've been having this chat with Dr. Bobby Fokidas. He is a professor at Rollins College in the biology department, chair of the department. We've been talking about the coyote sightings. And I guess my last question for you is there a way for people to learn a little bit more about local wildlife? Maybe give us some reading assignments, Professor?
Well, there's certainly no shortage of organizations here in Florida. I think that's one thing I do like about Florida is everyone's really proud of their wildlife here. A good place to start would be the Orange County Audubon Society. They have good tabs on wildlife and actually do some work on the Genes Preserve themselves. They actually go out there and survey the bird diversity, and they know a bit about coyotes as well. And the other good resource would be, if you're interested in a specific animal, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission website, the FWC. They do a great job of sort of maintaining information on everything going on in the state with regards to fish and wildlife. And there are actually even a lot of citizen science that you can contribute to if you're really interested in both of those. Report your sightings online.